He gathers all the employees for a fun team activity. Suddenly, a young woman faints in the middle of the crowd. As she falls, her hand reveals a hidden wedding ring. And this mystery leaves the millionaire speechless. What do you think will happen in this story? Comment and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear. The skyscrapers of Fifth Avenue reflected the Monday morning sun as Julia Evans walked through the revolving doors of Nexus Tech, one of the most promising companies in the American market. At 32, having graduated with honors in software engineering from MIT, Julia possessed an extraordinary talent that paradoxically remained invisible in the mirrored corridors of that commercial building. As she swiped her badge at the electronic turnstile, she subtly adjusted the bandage on her left ring finger, a seemingly trivial detail that, within a few hours, would completely change the course of her life. Nexus was the empire built by Richard Miller, a 45-year-old New York City entrepreneur who had transformed a small software development business into a national powerhouse. Known for his demanding temperament and genius in identifying market trends, Richard was admired and feared in equal measure. Few knew that behind that image of unshakable success lay carefully guarded secrets that connected his trajectory to Julia's in ways no one in the company could imagine. "Good morning, Ju. How did you see the board's email?" asked Denise, a colleague from the innovation department, as Julia placed her bag on her desk. "Didn't have time yet. The subway was delayed today," she replied, turning on her computer. "Did something happen?" "Mandatory meeting in the main auditorium at 10 o'clock. Richard himself will lead it. They say it's a surprise dynamic for the whole team," Denise explained with a curious glint in her eyes. "You know how he is with these sudden ideas." Julia felt a tightening in her stomach. Richard Miller's famous dynamics were known for exposing vulnerabilities and testing limits. In 5 years working at Nexus, she had specialized in remaining in the shadows, contributing brilliant projects without ever claiming the spotlight. The strategy had worked perfectly until then, a calculated invisibility that protected her from curious glances and inconvenient questions. When the clock struck 9:55, employees from all departments converged on the spacious auditorium on the 12th floor. The environment was impeccably organized, rows of chairs arranged in a semicircle, a central screen and a state-of-the-art sound system. Julia chose a seat in the second row, not too far forward to draw attention, nor too far back to appear disinterested. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Richard enter, accompanied by the executive board. "Good morning, everyone," Richard's deep voice echoed through the sound system. "I appreciate each of your presences. As you know, Nexus didn't get where it is by following conventions. Innovation is our fuel, and today we're going to do a different exercise." The audience of over 200 employees watched in silence. Richard continued, "Each of you represents a vital piece in this organism that is our company. But today I want to see something beyond technical competence. I want to see courage, creativity, and above all, loyalty." As he explained the dynamic, an improvised presentation on solutions for a fictitious client in crisis, Julia felt her hands begin to sweat. The bandage on her finger itched, constantly reminding her of what was hidden there. She tried to concentrate on the instructions, but her mind drifted 5 years into the past, to the moment when her path and Richard Miller's had inextricably intertwined. "We'll start by calling randomly," Richard announced, holding a tablet. "The system will choose the name, and the person will have 3 minutes to present their solution to the problem presented." The first selected was Marion from the finance department, followed by 2 marketing analysts. Julia breathed faster and faster, a sensation of vertigo growing as names were called. She discreetly glanced at her bandaged finger. The bandage was starting to come loose at one end. Next participant, Julia Evans, Innovation Department. The entire auditorium seemed to spin. Julia stood up mechanically, as if her body responded to an automatic command while her mind collapsed. She walked to the improvised stage, feeling the weight of curious gazes. She rarely spoke in meetings, let alone in front of the entire company. "Julia will develop a solution for the following scenario," Richard explained, his eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. "A client has lost access to all proprietary data after a cyber attack. They need emergency recovery and a system to prevent future leaks. Standing before the microphone, Julia tried to articulate the first words, but her voice failed. The room seemed increasingly hot, the lights too intense. Her gaze met Richard's for an instant. There was something beyond the professional challenge in that silent exchange, something that harked back to old promises and unverbalized agreements. To solve this problem, she began when she felt the bandage detach completely. It was then that everything happened. The combination of anxiety, heat, and repressed memories hit Julia like an overwhelming wave. Her vision darkened at the edges, her legs gave way, and before she could complete her sentence, her body collapsed. The feint was quick, but enough for her hand to hit the microphone stand as she fell. The metallic sound of something small falling and rolling across the stage cut through the shocked silence of the auditorium. The golden ring that had been hidden under the bandage spun a few times before stopping exactly at Richard Miller's feet. For a fleeting moment, the entrepreneur's expression betrayed his usual self-control. A flash of recognition, perhaps panic, crossed his normally impassive face. As colleagues rushed to help Julia, Richard discreetly bent down and picked up the ring. No one but him could see the inscription engraved on its inside. Project Phoenix. 2019, shared intellectual property. That was not a wedding ring, as everyone would assume. It was physical proof of an agreement that could destabilize the entire empire built under Richard Miller's name. In the following minutes, chaos took over the auditorium. Julia was taken to the company infirmary, while whispers spread among employees. The dynamic was abruptly interrupted, with Richard announcing it would resume on another occasion. But the damage was already done. Curiosity had been aroused. Why would a discreet programmer like Julia faint in front of her boss? And what did that object Richard collected so quickly mean? In the small company infirmary, Julia regained consciousness, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Her first instinct was to touch her now unprotected finger, discovering with horror that the ring had disappeared. "Are you okay?" asked Deborah, the nurse. "Your blood pressure dropped quite a bit. Does this happen often?" "No. Julia hesitated, unable to explain the true reason for her malaise. The door opened and Felicity Ross, HR director and Richard's right-hand woman, entered the room with a worried expression. "Julia, you gave us quite a scare. Richard is worried and asked me to check on you." Felicity approached, lowering her voice. "He also asked me to give you this." Discreetly, she placed the ring in Julia's hand. "And to say that you two need to talk today in his office after hours." Julia closed her fingers around the small metallic object, feeling its weight disproportionate to its physical dimension. The ring symbolized not a romantic commitment, but a professional secret that now threatened to come to light. A secret involving intellectual property, millions of dollars, and a creative betrayal that had shaped the success of Nexus Tech. "Tell him I'll be there," she replied, discreetly putting the ring back on her finger and covering it with a new bandage offered by the nurse. What none of the three women in the infirmary noticed was the presence of Gregory Peterson, project manager and aspiring director, who was casually passing by the corridor and had overheard fragments of the conversation. His eyes gleamed with renewed interest as he quietly moved away, calculating how that information could benefit him in the corporate climb he had been planning for years. Meanwhile, on the 15th floor, Richard Miller cancelled all his afternoon appointments. For the first time in a long time, the controlled entrepreneur tasted the bitter flavor of fear. The dynamic he had planned to subtly test Julia's loyalty had turned into a public exposure of the bond that united them. A bond that, here fully revealed, could not only tarnish his reputation, but also question the very legitimacy of the technology that had made Nexus a market leader. The digital clock in the corner of the screen read 7:42 p.m. when Julia finally shut down her computer. The floor was practically empty. Only a few emergency lights illuminated the path to the panoramic elevator. She adjusted the bandage on her finger, now reinforced with tape, and took a deep breath before pressing the button for the 15th floor. Her reflection in the cabin mirror revealed a woman seemingly composed, but whose eyes betrayed the inner storm. The doors opened directly into the executive hall of Nexus. Unlike the operational floors, with their open cubicles and glass walls, the executive area exuded an aura of discreet power. Dark wood, Soft lighting and a reverential silence. The secretary had already left, but the main office door was ajar, a strip of golden light cutting across the grey carpet. "Come in." "Julia, I'm waiting for you." Richard's voice sounded even before she knocked. The office was immense, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a privileged view of the illuminated Fifth Avenue. Richard stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his tie slightly loosened, subtle signs that his usual control was shaken. "How are you feeling?" he asked, indicating an armchair. "Physically fine. Professionally exposed," Julia replied, remaining standing. "What happened today shouldn't have happened." Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass before answering. "I agree. It was an unfortunate accident, but now we need to manage the consequences. Consequences you created with this surprise dynamic. It wasn't a coincidence that my name was chosen, was it?" Julia's tone carried an implicit accusation. "I needed to know if I could trust you," Richard admitted after a moment of hesitation. "There are rumors that Apex Solutions is trying to replicate our technology. I needed to be sure you weren't sharing information." Julia let out a dry laugh. "After 5 years of upholding our agreement, after watching you build an empire with my work, you still doubt my discretion?" The silence that followed seemed to materialize 5 years of shared history between them. 5 years since Julia, then a recent graduate and participant in a tech challenge promoted by Richard, developed the revolutionary algorithm that would become the backbone of Nexus's products. 5 years since, in a moment of naivety and ambition, she signed a contract that partially ceded the rights to her creation in exchange for a stable job and a minority share in the profits, a share that never materialized as promised. "The ring," Richard finally spoke, pointing to Julia's finger. "You still wear it. It's not sentimentality, if that's what you're thinking. It's a daily reminder of the biggest lesson I learned in life. Never trust verbal promises." The words hung in the air like small daggers. Both knew that that ring, forged by Richard as a symbol of the marriage of their brilliant minds, had become for Julia a bitter reminder of lost opportunities and denied recognition. "Let's be practical," Richard resumed, walking to his imposing desk. "Today's incident generated curiosity, but nothing we can't control. We'll say you have low blood pressure, that the stress of the presentation caused the malaise. As for the ring, well, we can let them assume it's a personal matter of yours." "And what do I get out of this?" Julia asked, her eyes fixed on his. "Another 5 years of invisibility? More promises that I'll eventually receive credit for Project Phoenix? How's it get?" Richard slightly raised his voice, a rare display of emotion. "Julia, Nexus gave you stability, a salary above the market average. Our agreement was legal, and you signed it knowingly. An agreement that you know very well was unbalanced. I was 27, Richard. You offered me the world when I had no experience to understand the true value of what I had created." The entrepreneur sighed, opening a drawer and pulling out a folder. "Perhaps it's time to revisit this agreement. I'm willing to consider a promotion. Director of Innovation, with a share in the department's profits." Julia's eyes briefly sparkled, but her expression quickly hardened. "That's not generosity, it's fear. You're worried about what I might reveal." "I'm offering an opportunity, Julia. Think carefully before refusing it." At that moment, a notification on Richard's phone broke the tension. He looked at the screen, his expression subtly changing. "We need to continue this conversation tomorrow. I have an unmissable commitment." Julia nodded stiffly and walked to the door. As she passed Richard, she stopped for an instant. "Know that I'm no longer that naive young woman from 5 years ago." As the elevator descended, Julia couldn't hold back the tears she had repressed throughout the conversation. Richard's proposal was tempting. A directorship represented power, recognition, the chance to finally make her voice heard. But it also meant continuing his game, perpetuating the silence about who really created the algorithm that had made Nexus a national benchmark. Across town, in a luxury apartment in the affluent Greenwich suburb, Gregory Peterson typed frantically on his laptop. After hearing the conversation in the infirmary, he spent the entire afternoon researching connections between Julia and Richard. As a project manager, he had access to historical company files, and something in the mention of Project Phoenix had piqued his curiosity. In the first few hours, he found nothing significant, but his persistence was rewarded when he discovered, in old backups preliminary project, documents with Julia's name as the lead developer, documents that had later been replaced by versions crediting the innovation to a team led by Richard Miller. So, that's it, he murmured to himself, a calculating smile forming on his lips. The invisible darling is actually the brain behind the company's most profitable product. His phone vibrated with a message. Information verified. The girl participated in the 2019 Tech Challenge and won the main prize with a project very similar to what would become Nexus's flagship. Else, Gregory had activated a contact in the journalistic world, Mark Porter, an investigative reporter specialized in technology, who coincidentally was preparing an article on innovation in the American market, the story of a brilliant developer whose work was appropriated by a powerful entrepreneur would be perfect for the profile Mark was building. I want more details. And I need a way to approach her without raising suspicion, Gregory replied. The next day, Nexus seemed to vibrate with a different energy. Curious glances followed Julia in the corridors. Whispers ceased when she approached. The auditorium incident had spread, amplified by speculations about the relationship between her and the powerful CEO. Julia, do you have a minute? Denise's voice reached her as she poured coffee in the pantry. Sure, what is it? It's just, well, everyone's talking about yesterday. Denise hesitated, uncomfortable. And Gregory is spreading that you were called into Richard's office after hours. What? Julia almost dropped her cup. Sorry to be indiscreet, but as a friend I thought you should know. There are rumors that you and Richard might have a personal involvement. Julia's blood ran cold. It was exactly the kind of distortion Richard had predicted, and perhaps even desired, because a supposed love affair would be more easily manageable than the truth about intellectual property. That is absolutely false, she replied firmly. I was called to discuss a project, just that. Denise seemed relieved, but not entirely convinced. If you need to talk... Thanks, but I'm fine, Julia forced a smile. I need to finish that code review now. Upon returning to her desk, she found a discreet envelope with her name on it. Inside, a business card from Mark Porter, a journalist from Tech Insights magazine, with a handwritten note on the back. I'd like to talk about innovation and female recognition in the technology sector. Your name was recommended as an example of talent not yet fully recognized. Can we meet? Julia stared at the card for long minutes. The message seemed innocent, but the coincidence was unsettling. How would a journalist specifically reach her? A deliberately discreet employee, right after the incident that exposed her connection to Richard. Her computer alerted her to a new message, an email from Felicity Ross from HR. Julia, Richard asked me to inform you that your promotion to Director of Innovation will be announced next Monday. Please come to HR today at 3 p.m. to sign the necessary documentation. Congratulations on the recognition of your talent. The computer screen seemed to blur before her eyes. Everything was happening too fast. The promotion, the rumors, the journalist's contact, pieces of a puzzle she still couldn't fully decipher. Slowly, Julia rotated the ring under the bandage. A decision needed to be made, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt that control of the situation might be in her hands. The Botanical Cafe, in the Upper East Side, was known for its discretion, spaced-out tables, ambient music at a precise volume to hinder unwanted eavesdropping, and a clientele that valued privacy. It was there that Julia chose to meet Mark Porter, 3 days after receiving his card. During that time, her life at Nexus had drastically changed. Her promotion to Director of Innovation had been announced in an internal memo, sparking reactions ranging from sincere admiration to thinly disguised envy. Richard, in turn, treated her with calculated cordiality in public, while in private meetings he made clear what he expected of her: absolute loyalty and continued silence about the past. Ms. Evans. Mark Porter from Tech Insights, the man of about 40, with graying temples and shrewd eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses, extended his hand. Thank you for accepting my invitation. I confess I was curious as to how my name reached you, Julia replied, carefully studying the journalist's expression. Mark smiled, settling into his chair. I'm preparing a series of reports on national technological innovation. with a special focus on talents who don't always receive the spotlight they deserve. Your participation in the 2019 Tech Challenge caught my attention. The mention of the event made Julia subtly stiffen. The Tech Challenge had been the starting point of everything, the moment her revolutionary algorithm caught Richard Miller's attention. It was an interesting event, but it was a long time ago, she replied cautiously. Long enough for the winning project to evolve into something very similar to Nexus's current flagship, Mark observed, maintaining a casual tone while carefully watching her reaction. By the way, congratulations on your recent promotion. Director of Innovation is an impressive position. How do you know about my promotion? It was only announced internally. Mark took a sip of his coffee before answering, I have good sources in the sector. It's my job to be informed about significant movements in the technology market. The conversation continued in this game of insinuations and evasions for almost an hour. Julia, trained by years of self-restraint, answered the journalist's questions with meticulous care, revealing nothing substantial about her true contribution to Nexus's success. Mark, in turn, demonstrated the patience of an experienced fisherman, casting strategic baits and observing ripples on the seemingly calm surface of his interviewee. You know, Julia, he finally said, closing his laptop, I believe we have more to discuss than we managed to cover today. I'd like to continue our dialogue on another occasion. I don't know if I'd have much more to add, she replied, putting her coat back on. Perhaps I would. Mark discreetly slid a USB drive across the table. Here are some documents that might refresh your memory about certain code developments that bear remarkable similarities to your original creations. It would be interesting to discuss these coincidences. Julia's heart raced, but her face remained impassive. What exactly are you looking for with this, Mr. Porter? The truth, Ms. Evans. Isn't that what every journalist seeks? He smiled, leaving money on the table to pay the bill. My number is on the card. When you're ready for a truly frank conversation, I'll be available. After the journalist left, Julia remained seated, the USB drive weighing in her hand as if it were made of lead. The object represented both threat and possibility, depending on its content and how she chose to handle the situation. That same afternoon, in the luxurious apartment she kept in Greenwich Village, Julia connected the device to her personal computer, taking care to use an isolated virtual machine. The content made her face pale. Side-by-side comparisons between the code she had developed at the Tech Challenge and snippets of Nexus's current proprietary system. Patent registrations with temporal inconsistencies. And more disturbingly, an old email from Richard to his lawyer discussing how to restructure Project Phoenix documentation to clarify intellectual property. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the documents. The inevitable question formed in her mind: how had Mark gained access to such sensitive information? Was someone inside Nexus feeding the journalist confidential data? And for what purpose? Her phone call interrupted her thoughts. It was Richard. Julia, we need to talk. I heard you met with a journalist today. The coldness in his voice sent a chill down her spine. Once again, the speed with which information reached Richard surprised her. Was she being followed? It was just a conversation about women in technology, she replied, trying to sound casual. Don't insult my intelligence. Mark Porter is known for investigations that bring down reputations. What did he want? Why don't you ask whoever handed me his card inside your corporate building? It seems you have more serious leaks to worry about. A tense silence followed on the other end of the line, before Richard spoke again, now in a more controlled tone. We need to meet. Not at the office. My driver will pick you up at your home in an hour. Before Julia could protest, the call ended. She looked again at the computer screen, at the documents that exposed the truth she had silently carried for 5 years. On an impulse, she copied all the content to another USB drive, which she hid inside a book on the shelf before turning off the machine. Exactly an hour later, a discreet black Mercedes parked in front of her building. The driver said nothing more than a polite "good afternoon" before taking her to Central Park. There, away from the main trails, Richard awaited her on an isolated bench, his grave demeanor contrasting with the serene beauty of the artificial lake. You crossed a dangerous line today, he said without preamble when she sat beside him. Me? I just had coffee with a journalist. You're the one monitoring me as if I were a criminal. Don't play naive. Porter is investigating patents and intellectual property. He's already tried to contact other Nexus employees. Julia absorbed the information, realizing the journalist was digging deeper than she had imagined. And what does that have to do with me? The agreement we signed is legal. You yourself always make a point of reminding me. Richard turned to face her directly. What did he show you? The question confirmed her suspicions. Richard feared that compromising documents had leaked, documents that could challenge the official narrative about the development of Project Phoenix. Nothing I didn't already know, she replied evasively. So the question is, what are you willing to do to keep this story from coming out? A flash of anger crossed Richard's face, quickly replaced by a calculating expression. I thought your promotion made my commitment to your future at the company clear. A directorship is not recognition, Richard. It's a position. What I want is credit for my work, not just within Nexus, but publicly. That's impossible. Rewriting the development history of our main product now would affect market confidence, investors. We could lose millions. So you prefer the story to be rewritten by an investigative journalist. The tension between them was almost palpable. In the distance, children played carefree, an ironic contrast to the silent war unfolding on that park bench. What exactly do you want, Julia? Richard finally asked, his voice betraying weariness. A new agreement. Recognition as co-creator in all future evolutions of the algorithm. Real profit sharing as originally promised. And freedom to develop my own projects within the company. Richard pondered for long seconds. I can consider your conditions, but I need an absolute guarantee that this story won't leak to the press. And we need to know who is feeding Porter internal information. At that moment, a few meters away, partially hidden by a leafy tree, Gregory Peterson discreetly captured photos of the meeting with a long-range camera. The ambitious manager had been the source who provided documents to Mark, after carefully selecting what to share, enough to pique the journalist's interest, but insufficient for a conclusive report. His plan was more complex. Use the journalist to pressure both Richard and Julia, strategically positioning himself as an ally or adversary, depending on who offered better prospects for his own ascent. The next day, Nexus was buzzing with unexpected news. The company had just lost a multi-million-dollar bid to implement security systems for an international bank. The client had opted for Apex Solutions, its main competitor, citing concerns about the originality and ownership of the technology offered as a decisive factor. Julia was urgently summoned to the executive meeting room, where she found Richard and the entire board in a state of agitation. It's a disaster, said Felicity Ross, HR director. Apex's statement insinuates that our technology would be derived from concepts they developed. That's absurd, Richard retorted. Our technology is proprietary and original. All eyes turned to Julia when she entered, some questioning, others openly accusatory. Julia, Richard addressed her with studied formality, as the new director of innovation, we need your analysis on this setback. Is there any technical possibility that our solution has similarities with Apex's? The question was a veiled trap. If she denied any similarity, she would also be discarding any future argument about the originality of her own contribution. If she admitted possible similarities, she could be accused of negligence or even leaking privileged information. I would need to analyze Apex's solution in detail before forming any founded technical opinion, she replied diplomatically. But I can lead an internal audit to verify the integrity of our intellectual property protection systems. The answer, technically impeccable, seemed to please most of those present. Only Gregory, sitting at the back of the room, observed the scene with an interest that went beyond the immediate crisis. When the meeting ended, Richard asked Julia to stay. As soon as they were alone, his demeanor changed radically. This is no coincidence, he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. First the journalist, now this blow from Apex. Someone is coordinating these attacks. And you think that someone is me? Julia asked directly. Richard studied her for a long time before answering, No, you have too much to lose if Nexus is shaken. But we need to find out who is behind this. Perhaps it's time to reveal the truth on our own initiative, Julia suggested. Renegotiate our agreement and present a controlled narrative about the development of Project Phoenix. Not yet. Richard shook his head. First, we need to neutralize this threat, and for that I need you to take on a more visible role. What are you suggesting? The International Tech Fair in 2 weeks. You will be our main spokesperson, presenting the system's evolutions, a public demonstration of confidence in the integrity of our technology. The proposal was simultaneously an opportunity and a test. Richard was offering Julia exactly what she always wanted, public recognition, but in a potentially explosive scenario, where any insinuation about the true origin of the algorithm could trigger a disaster. The Metropolitan Convention Center was transforming into an epicenter of innovation as the International Tech Fair took shape. Sophisticated booths, high-definition screens, and futuristic prototypes created an atmosphere of technological fascination. Nexus's space stood out for its minimalist elegance, walls in deep blue tones, the company logo in pulsating white neon, and a central arena where demonstrations would happen throughout the 3-day event. Backstage, Julia frantically reviewed her presentation. 2 weeks had passed since her conversation with Richard, a period during which she had been catapulted from relative obscurity to the position of the company's official spokesperson. Interviews in specialized portals, appearances on industry podcasts, and even a spot on NBC Nightly News had built a public image that dramatically contrasted with her previous profile. 20 minutes until your presentation, Julia, informed Amanda Cole, Nexus's event coordinator, handing her a bottle of water. The auditorium is packed and Richard just arrived with some international investors. Thanks, Amanda. Is the demo system all set? Gregory finished setting everything up half an hour ago. He asked me to let you know he made some last-minute adjustments to ensure everything runs perfectly. The mention of Gregory caused immediate discomfort in Julia. In recent weeks, the manager had been surprisingly helpful, offering assistance with the technical preparation for the fair. Richard, seemingly convinced of his loyalty, had assigned him as the main support for the presentation, a decision Julia had privately questioned, without success. What kind of adjustments? She asked, trying not to show concern. Technical details from what I understood. You know how meticulous he is. Amanda shrugged. Oh, there's a journalist insisting on speaking with you before the presentation. Mark Porter from Tech Insights magazine. Should I let him in? No, Julia replied quickly. Tell him I'll grant interviews only after the demonstration. Since their meeting at the cafe, Julia had carefully avoided any contact with Mark. The journalist had continued to send messages, increasingly direct, insinuating that he was about to publish an article about inconsistencies in the creation story of Project Phoenix. His presence at the fair was not surprising, but it considerably increased the pressure on her performance. As she adjusted her lapel microphone, Julia noticed Richard approaching, accompanied by a group of foreign-looking executives. He maintained his usual rehearsed smile, but his eyes communicated a clear message. There was no room for errors. Gentlemen, this is Julia Evans, our brilliant Director of Innovation, Richard introduced, placing a hand on her shoulder with calculated familiarity. She led the most recent developments of the system you will see today. The careful choice of words did not go unnoticed by Julia. Most recent developments was a way to acknowledge her current contribution without mentioning the original creation of the algorithm. That small semantic game perfectly represented the dynamic between them, a constant dance between truth and omission. We look forward to your presentation. Ms. Evans, said one of the investors, a tall man with a Scandinavian accent, especially after the rumors about alleged similarities with competing products. The comment, deliberately provocative, caused instant tension. Richard quickly intervened. Unfounded rumors, I can assure you. What you will see today is proprietary technology developed entirely in our laboratories. Julia maintained a professional smile, while internally a storm of emotions was brewing. Each new interaction reinforced the dilemma she faced. Continue Richard's game, perpetuating a lie that now partially benefited her, or break the cycle and risk everything she had achieved. The auditorium was completely packed when she stepped onto the stage. More than 500 people, including specialists, investors, journalists, and competitors, awaited anxiously. In the front row, Richard and the potential investors. To the side, partially hidden by a column, Mark Porter with his inseparable laptop. And in the back near the technical booth, Gregory observed with an interest that seemed to transcend the professional. "Good morning." "To everyone," Julia began, her voice firm, echoing through the sound system. "It is with great satisfaction that I present the evolution of our data security system, now with predictive artificial intelligence implementation." The first slides ran smoothly, showing performance graphs and success stories. The audience reacted positively, with murmurs of approval and frantic note-taking. Julia felt progressively more confident, dominating the stage with a presence that surprised even Richard. "Now let's move on to the practical demonstration. What you will see is a simulation of a cyber attack being identified and neutralized in real time by our system." She triggered the command on the tablet that controlled the presentation. A giant screen behind her was supposed to show the system operating, identifying suspicious patterns and implementing countermeasures automatically. Instead, a blue error screen appeared, followed by an alarming message: "Critical security failure. System compromised." A growing murmur took over the auditorium. Julia's heart raced, but years of self-discipline allowed her to maintain her composure. "It seems we are facing a technical problem," she said with studied calm. "This demonstrates precisely why robust recovery systems are essential." Her fingers flew across the tablet, trying to restart the demonstration, when something even more disturbing happened. The main screen suddenly displayed internal Nexus documents, including some of the same files Mark Porter had shown her, comparing the original tech challenge code with the company's current product. The sepulchral silence that followed was interrupted by Richard's voice. "End the projection." Now, but the system seemed frozen, unresponsive to commands. For an endless 30 seconds, confidential information was exposed to hundreds of witnesses. When the screen finally darkened, the damage was already done. Camera flashes went off frantically, while journalists typed on their smartphones with frenzy. Richard went on stage, taking control of the situation with the skill of an experienced politician. "I apologize for the technical inconvenience. It appears we were victims of a deliberate attempt at sabotage, which ironically demonstrates the importance of systems like ours. We will take a short break and return in 15 minutes with the presentation restored." Backstage, away from public view, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. Technicians worked frantically to identify the source of the failure, while executives discussed strategies to manage the public relations disaster. "What the hell happened out there?" Richard questioned harshly as soon as he found Julia in the support room. "Someone sabotaged the presentation," she replied, adrenaline replacing the initial shock. "Those documents, they're the same ones Porter showed me. Someone is trying to expose the truth about Project Phoenix." Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "This goes beyond simple sabotage. It was calculated, precise. Someone who knows our system from the inside." "Gregory's last-minute adjustments," Julia whispered, understanding dawning on her face. "Amanda mentioned he made modifications shortly before the presentation." "Gregory? But why? What would he gain from that?" Before they could explore that line of reasoning, Felicity rushed into the room. "The press is going crazy out there. The IT team identified the failure. Malicious code inserted this morning into the presentation server. And there's more. Mark Porter just tweeted that he's going to publish an exclusive article about the true story behind Nexus's software." Richard visibly paled. "We need a strategy now." "I have one," Julia said, surprising them both with her firmness. "I'm going back on stage and telling the truth. Have you lost your mind?" Richard almost shouted. "That would destroy everything we've built. What's being destroyed is Nexus's credibility, not because of me, but because of the lie you insist on maintaining." Julia stared at him directly. "The choice now is simple. We continue denying until someone publishes a distorted version of the story, or we take control of the narrative." A visible conflict played out on Richard's face: anger, fear, calculation, and finally resignation. "What exactly do you intend to say?" "The truth, but in a way that protects the company's future. I will acknowledge my original contribution without invalidating the subsequent development done by Nexus. A story of collaboration, not appropriation." Felicity, observing the exchange, cautiously intervened. "From a corporate communication standpoint, a narrative controlled by us would be preferable to being exposed by third parties. Richard pondered for long seconds before reluctantly nodding. "You have 10 minutes to prepare your speech, and I want to approve it before you go back on stage." When Julia returned to the auditorium, the atmosphere was charged with expectation. Cameras pointed at her like weapons, while hundreds of eyes evaluated her every move. In the front row, Richard maintained an impassive expression, having finally approved her approach after intense negotiations backstage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice surprisingly firm, "before we resume the technical demonstration, I would like to take this moment to clarify some aspects about the evolution of our system." The auditorium fell completely silent. The side, Mark Porter leaned forward, recorder in hand. In the back, Gregory had mysteriously disappeared. The algorithm that forms the backbone of Project Phoenix had its initial conception at a tech challenge hosted by Nexus in 2019, where I, as an independent participant, developed the fundamental concept that would later evolve into our current system. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Julia continued, maintaining the delicate balance between truth and diplomacy she had negotiated with Richard. Richard Miller's vision in recognizing the potential of that initial idea and offering Nexus's infrastructure for its development was the catalyst that transformed a promising concept into a revolutionary product. Our joint work over the past 5 years represents the best type of partnership between individual talent and corporate strength. As she continued to detail the creative partnership in carefully chosen terms, Richard remained motionless, his face a mask of professional approval. Only those who knew him deeply could notice the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers imperceptibly squeezed the arm of the chair. For Julia, each word represented a small victory, not the destructive revenge she could have sought, but public recognition that no one else could deny. The weight of 5 years of silence began to dissipate, replaced by the intoxicating feeling of finally existing fully under the lights and before the world. The headline of the Tech Insider US portal blared in bold letters, "Nexus admits revolutionary algorithm born from tech challenge." Below, a photo of Julia on stage at the International Tech Fair with a serene and determined expression. The article, although laden with speculation, essentially reproduced the narrative she had presented, the story of a strategic collaboration between a talented young woman and a visionary company. In the temporary office set up in the convention center, Richard analyzed the repercussion on social media and specialized portals. Most articles followed a similar line, highlighting the company's transparency and its innovative model of talent recognition. Some more critical publications questioned why this recognition took 5 years, but even these did not go so far as to characterize the situation as undue appropriation. "The strategy is working," observed Felicity, monitoring public perception metrics on her tablet. "We are controlling the narrative. Shares had a slight initial drop but have already stabilized." Richard nodded silently, his eyes fixed on a notification he had just received. Mark Porter cancels investigative article on Nexus. Sources say journalist lost exclusivity after revelations at the fair. "And the Scandinavian investors?" he asked, turning to Felicity. "Impressed with our corporate transparency, according to our contact. Paradoxically, the incident seems to have increased their confidence in the company's governance." A bitter smile formed at the corner of Richard's mouth. It was ironic that the partial exposure of the truth he so feared was in reality strengthening Nexus's image. Years of calculations to hide the algorithm's origin, only to discover that admitting it, under the right terms, generated reputational capital. "Where is Julia?" "Giving interviews in the main pavilion. She has become the center of attention." Meanwhile, at a side booth at the fair, Julia answered questions from a group of specialized reporters. Her transformation was remarkable. The previously reclusive developer now articulated answers with natural confidence, never crossing the invisible line she had negotiated with Richard. For every question about the past, she skillfully redirected the focus to the future and to the technical evolutions she had led since her arrival at Nexus. "Ms. Evans, how do you feel about finally receiving public recognition for your contribution?" asked a CNN journalist. Recognition is gratifying, of course, but I've always seen my work at Nexus as part of a larger collective effort, Julia replied, reciting the carefully rehearsed phrase. What truly moves me is seeing how the algorithm has evolved through the contribution of our entire development team. In the distance, observing the interview with a calculating gaze, Gregory Peterson typed furiously on his smartphone. The manager had discreetly returned to the fair after his temporary disappearance during the incident. His expression oscillated between frustration and planning. The carefully orchestrated sabotage had not produced exactly the results he expected. Mr. Peterson? A female voice interrupted his thoughts. Patricia Moore, Nexus Internal Security. Mr. Miller requests your immediate presence in room 204. Gregory felt a chill run down his spine, but maintained his composure. Of course. Any specific problem? I prefer Mr. Miller to explain personally, the woman replied with cold professionalism. In room 204, an isolated meeting space on the second floor of the convention center, Richard waited, accompanied by Felicity and a man Gregory did not immediately recognize. Gregory, thank you for coming so promptly, Richard said with a cordiality that did not reach his eyes. I believe you already know Paul Rivers, our digital security consultant. The recognition hit Gregory like a punch. Paul Rivers was a legend in cybersecurity circles, a former federal agent specialized in digital crimes, now providing services to elite corporations. Mr. Peterson, Paul greeted with a dry nod. We've been analyzing this morning's incident. Interesting things emerge when you track server access logs. Gregory maintained a neutral expression, although his heart rate had accelerated considerably. I imagine so. Any progress in identifying the saboteur? Actually, Paul replied, turning his laptop so everyone could see the screen. The system recorded an access at 7:14 a.m. this morning. Using your credentials, Mr. Peterson, 30 seconds later, the presentation file was modified to include a trigger that would expose the comparative documents when activated. The silence in the room was oppressive. Gregory quickly calculated his options, assessing defense routes and possible counterattacks. Obviously, there was a security breach. Someone must have cloned my badge or gained access to my credentials, he argued, keeping his voice firm. A possibility we considered, Paul agreed, until we checked the security cameras. With a fluid movement, the specialist slid his finger across the laptop screen, opening a video that clearly showed Gregory entering the technical control center at the exact time recorded in the logs. You know the most interesting thing about all this, Gregory? Richard finally spoke, abandoning any pretense of cordiality. It's not that you tried to sabotage me. I could even understand that. Ambition, revenge, the classic motives. What's fascinating is that you seem not to have understood that by exposing those comparative documents, you weren't just hurting me, but compromising the entire company, including your own future in it. Gregory abandoned his defensive facade, adopting a more calculating stance. Or perhaps I understood perfectly that Nexus was built on a lie that would eventually come to light. Perhaps I was just accelerating the inevitable, strategically positioning myself for what would come next. And how is that brilliant strategy working out for you? Felicity asked ironically. The narrative we feared is being completely neutralized by Julia's approach. The mention of her name made Gregory's face briefly contort. Julia is just a pawn in the game. Do you really think Mark Porter gave up? Or that there aren't other journalists investigating? The full truth will still come out. Perhaps, Richard admitted, standing up. But when it does, if it does, it won't be a story of intellectual property theft, but rather of belated recognition. And you, Gregory, won't be at Nexus to see it. Are you firing me? Based on circumstantial evidence of alleged sabotage? Richard smiled, a smile that contained absolutely no humor. No, Gregory. I'm firing you because you contacted a journalist and provided confidential company documents, explicitly violating your confidentiality agreement. Today's incident is just the icing on the cake. The color drained from Gregory's face. You can't prove that. We don't need to prove it to fire you. But if you want to contest it legally, I'm sure Paul will be happy to trace every bite of communication between you and Porter. When Gregory left the room, discreetly escorted by security guards, Richard turned to Felicity and Paul. I want a complete audit of all his accesses for the last 6 months. And monitor any contact with the press or competitors. What about Julia? Felicity asked. She became a public figure overnight. This considerably changes the power dynamic. Richard observed the fair's movement downstairs through the window, easily locating Julia by the small cluster of people surrounding her. Julia is too smart to become a threat, now that she's finally gotten what she wanted, he replied thoughtfully. We'll renegotiate our agreement, give her the public recognition and profit share she should have received from the start. Cheaper and strategically smarter than facing a public battle. At the closing of the fair, 3 days later, Nexus officially announced the appointment of Julia Evans as Vice President of Technology, a newly created position that placed her hierarchically just below Richard. The statement explicitly mentioned her fundamental contribution to the company's core algorithm and detailed her participation in the financial results of all products derived from the technology. For external observers, the narrative was inspiring, a talented young woman finally receiving deserved recognition, a modern company demonstrating appreciation for diversity and innovation. Forbes magazine even prepared a cover story titled, "The New Face of American Technology, How Julia Evans is Redefining Female Leadership in the Sector." But behind the scenes, a new and complex dynamic was established. The relationship between Richard and Julia transformed from a simple power hierarchy into a delicate balance of mutual interests. Both knew that, despite the carefully constructed public narrative, the complete truth remained between them, encoded in the small ring Julia still wore, now without the bandage. 2 weeks after the fair, during a strategy meeting on the 15th floor, Richard handed Julia a sealed envelope. Inside, an official document registering her participation as co-creator in all patents related to the original algorithm. "Consider this the formalization of our new agreement," he said, observing her with a mixture of newly acquired respect and caution. Julia meticulously analyzed the document, checking each clause. "Why now, Richard? After 5 years of denying, why concede so completely?" "Because intelligent people know when a battle is lost and when it's time to redirect energy to wars that can still be won," he replied with unusual frankness. "Besides, Nexus gains more with you as an ally than as an adversary." "And we both know there's still more," Julia commented, unconsciously twirling the ring on her finger. "The inscription mentions shared intellectual property, but the original agreement never truly reflected that." Richard observed the small metallic object for a long moment before responding, "That ring was a sentimental mistake on my part. I thought it would symbolize our partnership, but it ended up becoming evidence of something I tried to conceal. Ironic how a small detail can change everything, isn't it?" Julia smiled slightly. Faint, a ring falling and the entire power structure reconfigures. As she signed the document, Julia reflected on the extraordinary turnaround in her life. In just a few weeks, she had gone from invisibility to notoriety, from silence to an active voice. The exposure she so feared had, ironically, proven to be her greatest liberation. However, a question persisted in her mind. What would happen when, if, the complete truth about Project Phoenix came to light? Could the carefully edited narrative they presented to the world survive deeper scrutiny? And, more importantly, how would her own professional identity, now so intimately linked to Nexus's, be affected? The 3 months following the International Tech Fair radically transformed Julia's professional life. Her office on the 15th floor, adjacent to Richard's, offered a panoramic view of the city that mirrored her new elevated perspective in the corporate world. As Vice President of Technology, she commanded a team of 40 developers and had final authority over all technical decisions at Nexus. Her signature was now a mandatory requirement for any initiative related to Project Phoenix and its derivations. Thursday morning began with a video conference with potential European partners, followed by a strategic planning session with her team. At noon, when she finally had a moment's pause, Denise, now her personal assistant, rushed into her office. "Julia, an article just came out on Tech Insider about you. It's, well, different from what we're used to seeing." With a quick click, Denise projected the page onto the wall screen. The headline jumped out at Julia. "The contested genesis, new documents raise questions about Nexus's algorithm." The article, signed by an unknown journalist named Lucy Miles, did not have the investigative aggression that characterized Mark Porter's style, but it presented disturbingly accurate information. The article described in detail the original development of the algorithm at the Tech Challenge, citing anonymous testimonials from participants who clearly remembered Julia's winning project. More worryingly, the text mentioned the existence of a legal document with unbalanced clauses that had allegedly been used to transfer the rights to the creation. When was this published? Julia asked, keeping her voice controlled despite the growing anxiety. An hour ago. It already has over 5,000 shares, Denise replied. The legal department is analyzing it, and the press office is preparing a response. Richard called an emergency meeting for 2 p.m. Julia nodded, dismissing her assistant with a thank you. Alone, she approached the window, observing the constant flow of people below, small figures going about their routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the corporate heights. Her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. The truth always finds a way. We should talk. It wasn't hard to deduce that G referred to Gregory. After his dismissal, the ex-manager had disappeared from the radar, although rumors indicated he was negotiating with competing companies. The message confirmed what Julia suspected. Gregory had not finished his exposure campaign. At 2 p.m. sharp, the executive meeting room was filled with a tense atmosphere. Richard presided at the table, flanked by the legal director and the corporate communications team. When Julia entered, all eyes turned to her, some questioning, others supportive. Everyone has seen the article, I presume, Richard began, dispensing with formalities. The good news is that there's nothing there that directly contradicts the narrative we established after the fair. The mention of an unbalanced legal document is vague enough to be refuted. The problem is not this article itself, interjected Charles Davis, legal director. It's what it suggests, that there are sources progressively leaking internal information, building a broader case. We believe Gregory Peterson is behind this, Felicity added. He contacted Julia today. All eyes turned to her and she confirmed with a brief nod, a vague message suggesting a conversation. You must not, under any circumstances, meet him alone, Richard instructed categorically. Any communication can be used against you, against us. Julia observed Richard's expression, genuine concern mixed with habitual calculation. In recent months, their relationship had evolved into something closer to a partnership, though marked by scars from the past that would never completely disappear. Our strategy will be twofold, he continued. First, an official response reaffirming that Julia has always received due recognition within the company, and that her recent promotion was a natural result of years of valuable contribution. Second, we will accelerate the announcement of Project Aurora. Project Aurora was Julia's latest creation, a significant evolution of the original algorithm, integrating blockchain and quantum computing to create a virtually inviolable security system. She had been working on it secretly for almost 2 years, long before her public ascent, as a kind of personal insurance, tangible proof of her continuous genius, which went far beyond the initial creation of Phoenix. I don't think we should rush Aurora, Julia countered. We're still finalizing crucial tests. The timing is perfect, argued Laura Kent, marketing director. An announcement of revolutionary innovation, with you as the public face of the project from the start, would definitively establish your position as a continuous innovator, not just as the original creator of Phoenix. The logic was impeccable from a strategic point of view. Julia realized that the company was, ironically, heavily investing in establishing her reputation as a way to protect its own corporate narrative. All right, she finally agreed, but I need at least 2 weeks to finalize the security protocols. When the meeting ended, Richard asked Julia to stay. As soon as they were alone, his posture subtly changed, less the calculating CEO, more the tired man carrying the weight of past decisions. You know this is far from over, don't you? He asked, pouring himself some water. Gregory is just the beginning. Investigative journalists, competitors, everyone will smell blood. The question is, how far can this go? Julia considered carefully before answering. It depends on what else exists beyond what we already know. The original contract, the Tech Challenge documentation, other patent registrations, All of that is already partially in the public domain now, unless there's something more, Richard completed, his eyes fixed on her. Something like personal communications, suggesting deliberate intent of appropriation. Or perhaps records of specific promises that were made and not kept. The air between them was heavy with the weight of shared memories. Both knew exactly what he was referring to. Emails, text messages, even recordings of conversations from the early days, when Richard made grandiose promises to convince Julia to sign the disadvantageous agreement. "Do you keep records of that kind?" he asked directly. "Every programmer makes backups, Richard," Julia replied with a slight smile. "It's part of the nature of the job." The tension on his face was palpable. "And those backups, do they still exist?" "Some, perhaps. As insurance. Not unlike your decision to forge that ring with an inscription that could be used as legal proof." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "I always underestimated you, didn't I? Even now, when I think I finally understand who I'm dealing with. It's not personal, Richard. It's survival. You taught me that." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call. Richard's face transformed into a mask of shock as he listened to the caller. Hanging up, he stared at Julia with a grim expression. Apex Solutions just announced the hiring of a new director of strategic innovation, Gregory Peterson. The news, while surprising, made perfect sense within the intricate power game unfolding. Apex, Nexus's main competitor, had found in Gregory a valuable source of internal information and a key figure to destabilize the carefully constructed narrative after the fair. In the following weeks, the battle intensified on multiple fronts. While Julia led the finalization of Project Aurora, a series of investigative articles emerged in different outlets, each adding more details to the algorithm's creation story. At the same time, Apex began publicly insinuating that it would conduct in-depth technical reviews on structural similarities between technologies in the market. The climax came when the specialized site TechCrunch US published an extensive report titled "The Contested Algorithm and Investigation into Intellectual Property in the East." Coast Tech Hub, the meticulously documented text, presented a detailed chronology of the algorithm's creation, including excerpts from communications between Richard and Julia that could only have come from the backups she had mentioned. Nexus went into total crisis mode. Emergency meetings followed day and night. Strategies were developed and discarded in a matter of hours. Stock values fluctuated dangerously, while investors demanded explanations. Amidst the chaos, Julia maintained a disconcerting serenity. On a particularly tense afternoon, when the legal department discussed possible actions against TechCrunch, she interrupted the meeting with an unexpected proposal. "What if we held a joint press conference? Richard and I, side by side, presenting the complete story of the algorithm's development, without omissions." Followed immediately by the launch of Aurora, demonstrating that our partnership continues to produce revolutionary innovations. The room fell silent before the audacity of the proposal. It was Richard who finally spoke. That would mean publicly admitting that there were aspects of the initial agreement that were not fair. "Exactly," Julia confirmed. "We transform what could be a scandal of appropriation into a story of corporate redemption. Nexus acknowledges past mistakes and demonstrates how it corrected them, establishing a new paradigm of partnership with innovative talents." Richard's expression oscillated between admiration and discomfort. The proposal was brilliant from a strategic point of view, but it would require something he rarely offered: public vulnerability. What if the reaction is negative? If the market interprets this as an admission of guilt? "The market is already reacting to the fragmented narrative that is being built against us," Julia argued. "Taking control of the story is our only way to define its terms." After hours of heated debate, the board agreed to the approach. The conference was scheduled for the following week, in Nexus's main auditorium, the same place where, months earlier, Julia's faint had triggered the entire sequence of events. The night before the big day, Julia remained alone in her office until late, finalizing her part of the presentation. Through the glass wall, she could see Richard in his own office, equally absorbed in preparations. There was something almost poetic in the image of the two working separately, But in parallel, connected by a complex past and an uncertain future, her phone vibrated with a message from a number she now knew well. Tomorrow will be interesting. Apex will be watching closely. There's still time to consider more advantageous alternatives for your talent. Coyote smiled slightly, not bothering to reply. Gregory continued to underestimate her, just as Richard had for so long. He still hadn't realized that she was no longer playing their game. She had created her own board. The Nexus auditorium overflowed with the massive presence of journalists, investors, government representatives, and even competitors who had received formal invitations to what the official statement called a historic presentation on innovation and corporate ethics. Cameras from all major media outlets in the country were strategically positioned, while the company's public relations professionals coordinated the flow of people with the precision of a rehearsed choreography. Backstage, Julia adjusted her lapel microphone as she watched her reflection in the mirror. The navy blue suit, elegant and sober, had been carefully chosen to convey professionalism without ostentation. Her hair, usually tied in a simple bun, was loose over her shoulders, a small but significant visual change that symbolized her new freedom. "Are you ready?" Richard's voice interrupted her thoughts. He had just arrived, impeccably dressed as always, though the lines of tension on his face were visible to those who knew him well. "We are born ready for some moments, Richard." "I believe this is one of them," Julia replied, unconsciously twirling the ring on her finger, a habit she had developed over the years. His gaze fixed on the small metallic object. "You still wear it. Today more than ever. This ring is the only physical proof of the truth we are about to tell." Richard nodded silently. In recent days, during the intense preparation for this moment, a mutual understanding had developed between them, not exactly forgiveness or reconciliation, but a pragmatic recognition that their destinies were irrevocably intertwined. "The live broadcast begins in 2 minutes," Felicity announced, approaching with a tablet. "We have over 50,000 people watching online, in addition to the 200 present in the auditorium." "Any sign of Gregory or Apex representatives?" Richard asked. "Gregory is in the 3rd row, right side. He brought 2 Apex executives with him." Julia smiled slightly. "Perfect. The more witnesses, the better." At 10 a.m. sharp, the auditorium lights gradually dimmed as Richard and Julia took their places on stage, seated in armchairs arranged at a gentle angle, allowing both interaction between them and eye contact with the audience. Between them, a small table with 2 bottles of water. No podium, no physical barriers. The configuration had been meticulously planned to convey transparency and open dialogue. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began, his voice projecting with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime in positions of command. "We appreciate your presence on this significant day for Nexus Tech. We are here to share a story, the complete story of how a revolutionary idea was born, evolved and eventually transformed into the technology that positioned our company among the global leaders in digital security." He paused deliberately, his eyes scanning the audience before continuing. "But this is not just a story of technological innovation. It is also a narrative about people, decisions, mistakes, and, I hope, redemption." With these words, Richard began a chronological reconstruction of events, starting with the 2019 Tech Challenge. His narrative, carefully rehearsed, but presented with apparent spontaneity, described how he immediately recognized the revolutionary potential of the algorithm developed by Julia, a brilliant young woman recently graduated from MIT. "What I saw in that 5-minute presentation was nothing less than the future," he explained. "As an entrepreneur and investor, my instinct was to ensure that technology was under the Nexus umbrella. And it is here," his voice took on a graver tone, "that we made our first mistake." The auditorium fell completely silent. In the front rows, Nexus executives watched with tense expressions, while journalists typed frantically. In the 3rd row, Gregory maintained a slight smile, clearly satisfied with what he interpreted as an admission of guilt. "The contract we offered Julia, although legally valid, did not adequately reflect the true value of her contribution," Richard continued. "We used our position of power, our legal resources, and her inexperience to structure an agreement that disproportionately benefited Nexus. It was a calculated business decision, but one we now recognize as ethically questionable. At this point, Richard turned to Julia, signaling the transition to her part of the narrative. She took over naturally, describing her perspective of the same events, the thrill of having her work recognized, the ambition to join a promising company, and simultaneously, the gradual realization that she had conceded more than she should have. The issue was not just financial, Julia explained, her voice clear and firm. It was about recognition, about being able to see my name associated with something I created. For 5 years I kept this ring, she raised her hand, showing the small golden object, as a constant reminder of the agreement that had been made, an agreement that Richard symbolized with this object, engraved with the terms shared intellectual property. A murmur ran through the audience as an enlarged image of the ring, with its internal inscription clearly visible, was projected onto the giant screen behind them. That small piece of metal, previously hidden under a bandage, now exposed to hundreds of witnesses, perfectly symbolized the transformation that was occurring. What was once private became public. What was hidden was now deliberately revealed. The incident in the corporate dynamic, when I fainted and the ring publicly fell, created an inflection point, Julia continued. Suddenly, the secret we both kept, for different reasons, became visible. And with that visibility came an opportunity for renegotiation and redefinition. Over the next hour, Richard and Julia alternated, meticulously reconstructing the sequence of events that culminated in that press conference. They openly addressed the initial attempts to control the narrative, the sabotage at the fair, without explicitly mentioning Gregory, Julia's rise to leadership positions, and finally, the joint decision to present the complete story to the public. What we learned from this journey, Richard concluded, is that transparency and fair recognition are not just ethically correct, they are strategically intelligent. Nexus is a stronger company today because we finally aligned our practices with our stated values. A reflective silence hung over the auditorium when they finished the narrative. It was broken by a sharp question from a New York Times journalist. "Mr. Miller, isn't this public revelation simply an attempt to control damages after leaks that were already occurring? Why should we interpret this as sincerity and not as crisis management?" Richard smiled slightly before answering, "It's a valid question. I don't deny that we are responding to a situation that had already begun to become public. Forced sincerity is still sincerity, but it certainly doesn't deserve the same credit as voluntary transparency." The raw honesty of the answer seemed to surprise the journalist and the audience. Before other questions could be asked, Julia intervened. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to direct our attention to the future, because this conference is not just about recognizing past mistakes, but also about demonstrating how true collaboration can generate extraordinary innovations." With a fluid movement, she activated the prepared presentation of Project Aurora. On the giant screen, complex visualizations of the new system began to appear, accompanied by comparative data that demonstrated its superiority to any similar technology available on the market. Aurora represents not only a technical evolution of the original algorithm, but also an evolution in the model of collaboration and credit, Julia explained. This project was developed under a new paradigm within Nexus, a paradigm where recognition and reward are distributed proportionally to the real contribution of each participant. As she detailed the technical specifics of the innovation, cameras captured the audience's reaction. Investors leaned forward with renewed interest, journalists took frantic notes, and, most tellingly, Gregory's confident smile had disappeared, replaced by an expression of intense calculation. At the end of the technical presentation, Richard took the microphone again for the final announcement. "As part of our commitment to this new model, I am pleased to announce that Julia Evans is being promoted to co-CEO of Nexus Tech, with direct responsibility for all innovation and development operations." The surprise was genuine. Not even Julia expected this specific announcement, although she suspected Richard planned something impactful to conclude the conference. The promotion formally placed her on equal footing with Richard himself, an unprecedented redistribution of power in the company's history. When the question and answer session finally ended, after almost 2 hours of intense interaction with the press, Richard and Julia retreated to a private room adjacent to the auditorium. Only when the door closed, isolating them from the external commotion, did Julia allow herself to show her astonishment. "Co-CEO, that wasn't in the script we discussed." Richard poured himself water before answering, his expression a complex mixture of weariness and relief. Some decisions need to be made in the moment, based on the energy of the room. I realized we needed something definitive, irrefutable. It was a calculated move, then. Just to impress the audience? No, Richard shook his head slowly. It was the right decision. These last few months have shown me that you were always much more than just the creator of the algorithm. Your business instinct, your strategic vision. Nexus needs that. I need that. Julia studied him carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motives. What she found, surprisingly, seemed to be genuine respect, something Richard Miller rarely showed anyone. What about Gregory and Apex? They won't give up easily. Of course not. Richard smiled, an expression that now seemed more tired than arrogant. But we stole their moment. Any accusation they make now will seem petty and redundant. We've already told the story they wanted to expose, but on our own terms. At that moment, Felicity entered hastily, her face lit by unusual enthusiasm. You need to see this. Shares are up 5.06% since the end of the conference. The market is responding positively. Richard and Julia exchanged glances of genuine surprise. The reaction was better than either of them had predicted or dared to hope for. And there's more, Felicity continued, sliding her tablet towards them. The hashtag #NexusTransparency is among the top trending topics on Twitter, and LinkedIn is flooded with analysts praising the revolutionary approach to corporate governance. Truth as a market strategy, Julia murmured, almost to herself. Who would have thought? As they absorbed the initial news about the public reception, the door opened again. It was Mark Porter, the journalist who had initially approached Julia with compromising documents. "Can I steal a minute from you?" he asked, his tone surprisingly respectful. "I just wanted to say that I've followed many corporate confessions in my career, but I've never seen one executed with such authenticity. Impressive." Richard and Julia exchanged quick glances before Richard replied, "Thank you, Mark. Considering your usual skepticism, that's a significant compliment." "Don't be mistaken," the journalist smiled slightly. "I'm still investigating other aspects of Nexus's operation, but on this specific issue, you've achieved something rare in the corporate world. You transformed a potential crisis into a genuine opportunity." After the journalist left, Richard turned to Julia. "Well, it seems our gamble is paying off better than we expected." "For now," she replied, cautiously optimistic. "We still have a lot of work ahead to truly transform Nexus into the kind of company we claim to be today." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "Then we'd better get started. We have an empire to rebuild," co-CEO Evans. A year had passed since the historic press conference. Nexus's headquarters, once occupying 3 floors in the Fifth Avenue commercial building, now spanned an entire complex in the emerging East Coast tech hub, affectionately dubbed America's Silicon Valley. The new corporate campus, with its sustainable architecture and collaborative spaces, perfectly symbolized the transformation the company had undergone. Julia observed the city through her office's panoramic window. Friday afternoon brought that characteristic weekend-approaching energy, with hurried people on the sidewalks below. Her reflection in the glass revealed a transformed woman, not just by her more confident posture or more sophisticated look, but by a serenity that only comes with full self-affirmation. Lost in thought? Richard's voice interrupted her contemplation. He entered holding 2 champagne flutes, a tradition they had established to celebrate significant achievements. "Reflecting on how much we've changed this place," Julia replied, accepting the glass. "A year ago, we could barely imagine where we'd be today. To our shared vision," Richard raised his glass in a toast, "and to the impressive numbers in our quarterly report. Nexus had not only survived the public exposure of its past mistakes, it had prospered extraordinarily. Project Aurora had revolutionized the digital security market, setting new industry standards. More importantly, the story of transparency and corporate redemption had become a case study in business schools. attracting talent and investments that once seemed unattainable. "Did you see this month's Fortune cover?" Julia asked, pointing to the magazine on her desk. The photo showed the two co-CEOs side by side. Under the headline, "The New Corporate DNA, How Nexus Redefined Leadership in the Tech Sector." "Funny how the narrative has changed," Richard commented. "From corporate villain to pioneer in ethical governance. The press loves a redemption story." "Especially when it's genuine," Julia observed, studying him. Over the year, their relationship had evolved into something neither could have predicted. A partnership based on mutual respect, with occasional flashes of true friendship. The internal communication system interrupted their conversation. "Dr. Evans, your video conference with the Singapore investors is scheduled to begin in 5 minutes. "Thank you, Clara," Julia replied. "Please confirm." Richard checked his watch. "And I have that CNN interview in half an hour. See you at the charity dinner later." Julia nodded, remembering the gala event the Nexus Foundation for Technological Education would hold that night. The foundation, created by her 6 months after becoming co-CEO, had already granted scholarships to over 200 young people from underserved communities, with a special emphasis on developing female talent in technology. As Richard left, Julia instinctively adjusted the ring on her finger. No longer hidden, now a public symbol of the extraordinary journey she had lived. The small golden object had been incorporated into the foundation's logo, representing a commitment to transparency and shared opportunities. The video conference with the Asian investors went as planned, with particular interest in the company's next major launch, a fake news verification platform based on Aurora technology, which promised to revolutionize how information was validated online. While finalizing preparations for the charity event, Julia received a notification on her phone, an email from Gregory Peterson. After the historic conference, the former manager had remained at Apex for a few months, unsuccessfully trying to capitalize on the internal knowledge he possessed of Nexus. Eventually, his inability to produce significant revelations beyond what Nexus itself had already shared culminated in his discreet departure. "Julia," the email began, "after much reflection, I feel I must acknowledge your masterful play. You transformed what should have been exposure and shame into a launchpad for something greater. I still believe the beginning of it all was fundamentally unfair, but I cannot deny that the way you navigated the situation deserves respect. I will be leaving the country for a position in Europe and wanted to leave this message as a professional acknowledgement. Gregory." A small smile formed on Julia's lips. There was no vengeful satisfaction, just the understanding that even adversaries eventually recognize merit when confronted with undeniable results. The Metropolitan Event Hall was magnificently decorated for the Nexus Foundation's charity dinner. Soft blue lights, referencing the corporate colors, blended with natural elements, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously sophisticated and welcoming. Business leaders, politicians, celebrities, and most importantly, the Foundation's young scholarship recipients circulated through the environment, creating an unusual but powerful mix. Dressed in an elegant black dress with golden details that subtly evoked the ring, a symbol of her story, Julia was mingling with guests when she was approached by a young woman of approximately 20 years old. "Dr. Evans, I'm Gabriel Smith, a Foundation Scholarship recipient. I wanted to personally thank you for the opportunity that changed my life." Julia smiled, immediately recognizing the name. "Gabrielle from the underserved community, right? I read your project on recognition algorithms for early medical diagnosis. Impressive." The young woman's eyes sparkled with surprise and gratitude. "You really read it?" "I can't believe it." "Of course I did. Do you know what's more valuable than money in the corporate world, Gabriel? Genuine recognition. Never underestimate the power of that." The conversation was interrupted by the announcement that the formal ceremony would begin shortly. On the main stage, Richard was already waiting to deliver the opening speech. When Julia joined him, a spontaneous round of applause rose from the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, "welcome to the first annual celebration of the Nexus Foundation for Technological Education. Tonight is not about us, but about the future we are helping to build through these extraordinary young people." As he continued his carefully prepared speech, Julia observed the faces in the audience, especially the young scholarship recipients, with their hopeful and determined gazes. In them, she saw reflections of herself years ago, when she arrived at the tech challenge with a revolutionary algorithm and even bigger dreams. When it was her turn to speak, Julia dispensed with the prepared speech and simply removed the ring from her finger, holding it up for everyone to see. This small object carries a story that many of you know, a story of innovation, of obstacles, of overcoming. But tonight, I want it to symbolize something more, the promise that talent, when truly nurtured and respected, can transform not only individuals but entire systems. A respectful silence fell over the hall as she continued. Real power is not in positions or titles. It is not in who can silence or control others. True power is in transforming challenges into platforms for positive change. Julia then invited all the scholarship recipients present to join her on stage, dozens of young people from diverse backgrounds, united by the opportunity the foundation had provided them. True innovation is born when different voices are heard, when diverse talents are recognized. This is the most valuable lesson I learned on my journey, and it is the principle that guides this foundation. The ovation that followed was deafening. Photographers captured the emblematic moment, Julia at the center, surrounded by young talents, while Richard observed with an expression that mixed professional pride and genuine respect. Later that night, as the event drew to a close, Julia found a moment of quiet on one of the Cultural Spaces terraces. The night view of the city stretched out before her, an urban constellation of lights that seemed to reflect the infinite possibilities of the future. Denise, now Nexus's director of special projects, approached with 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Incredible night, Ju. Are you okay?" Julia smiled, accepting the drink. "Better than okay. You know that feeling of being exactly where you're supposed to be? Considering where you were a year ago, it's quite a transformation." The transformation began much earlier, Julia reflected. The moment I decided I wouldn't be defined by the limits others imposed, that I would find my own voice. The 2 women contemplated the city in comfortable silence for a few moments, until Denise spoke again. "I read that Apex is facing difficulties after Aurora set a new market standard. Ironic, considering Gregory's efforts to destabilize Nexus." "It's not about revenge," Julia shook her head. "It never was. It's about creating something that speaks for itself, something no one can deny or diminish." Julia's phone vibrated with a notification, an email confirming that her book, Invisible Code, revealing the algorithm of success, had been finalized by the publisher and would be in bookstores the following month. Another platform to share her story and inspire others to find their own voice. As she put away her phone, Julia contemplated the ring on her finger one last time that night. The small golden circle that once symbolized confinement now represented something completely different. Not a prison, but a constant reminder that transformation begins when we decide to reframe our own stories.